In this segment, we have Kelsey Skoch. She's an international speaker, MC, and author who shares her faith at Catholic events, such as the NCYC, Seek, and World Youth Day. After graduating from the University of Kansas, her passion for mission started when she interned for 2 Fortune 500 companies and saw the greater need for Christ in our world. From serving over 8 years with focus on college campuses and in the parish, she is most known for her ministry and talks helping women in their personal purity. She currently resides with her husband and children in Denver, Colorado. Kelsey, thanks for being with us for the She Summit.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Really glad to have learned of you just like a few days ago, really, at the time that we're recording this. But I'm really glad that I found even more women to be a part of our summit. When we first started planning this event, I thought, having 20 women would be awesome, to have 20 ladies represented, talking about their stories and sharing. And then I was like, how about an audacious goal of 30? Like, that would be impossible. And now you're number 40, which is amazing and exciting. And it's like, thank you, God, for bringing all of these women I didn't know about who are talking about their stories. Thank you for bringing them to light and letting them be a part of what's going on here at the She Summit. So again, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, appreciate it. So
as we are talking about these issues, obviously you have a foot in this, you have an arm in this, you have a passion in this. And so I'd love for you just to take the next several minutes to share with us your own story and how you became passionate about this area and why you decided to start speaking up about it as well.
Yeah, of course. So like many women on here and that have been invited for this summit, talking about pornography and masturbation struggles are a part of my story. And I wish that wasn't the case, but I think I'm so thankful that it is because of the ability I have now to speak out about these very real issues in a woman's life. So for me, it was around the age of 12, where, I was just innocently flipping through TV stations, primetime television, HBO, on demand kind of stuff. And I stumbled across a very crude movie series. And I don't even need to name it because it's like there are so many now. It could be anyone that you've already seen. But they demonstrated a behavior that I had never heard of before. I knew what sex was, but this was something I didn't know about. And so really the first time I fell into masturbation was out of mere curiosity, kind of, let's see what this is about. And I noticed that when I did fall into this, it would relieve me of my stress. For just a moment, I'd forget about any relationship issues, family issues, exhaustion, or about tests or anxiety, whatever it might have been. I was like, oh, this is actually really nice. And so really throughout my adolescence and into high school, it kind of became my constant companion, just something I would rely on to get me out of those anxious moments or high stress moments of high school, teenage years. And at the time, I wouldn't have said I had an addiction to pornography at all because, I was justified in what I was doing because I was just watching movies that were on normal television, as I thought. And, I started getting more involved in my faith in high school, and I started listening to chastity speakers and things like that. And no one ever spoke to women on pornography and masturbation. That just wasn't really a part of the discussion. So I learned about, why to wait for marriage for sex and what sex was meant for and all of these things. But I just assumed, okay, masturbation is really just a healthy way, an alternative to avoid STDs and to not, get pregnant and to avoid that unhealthy attachment to someone who may not be your spouse in the future. Really, this is just a great option or an outlet. I'm a very logical person. That's why it took me so long to really come back into my faith. And when I did come back into my faith, I saw how much logic and truth there was to the teachings of the church. But then I still wrestled with this one teaching that pornography and masturbation were wrong. I just didn't understand it. And so it wasn't until the end of college. So this is, 8, almost 9 years into my addiction. At this point, it's become a daily habit, or at least multiple times a week that I'm falling into this. And I started noticing, what I once used if I was doing an internet search on YouTube for most romantic movie scenes became most romantic sex scenes, right? I would start escalating what I was typing into the search bar. Again, still would never have at the time said this was pornography because I'm accessing it without any special, access point. It's just online. And so end of college, I really decided to put this to the test. And I had been told in my formation and church classes that essentially, if you have an addiction, it's something that you're putting before God, that you actually no longer have control in your own will and intellect to choose outside of your addiction. And I was like, okay, yeah, I understand when you're addicted to drugs and as an alcoholic could fall into these things, but I'm completely in control of my behavior of masturbation and pornography. This is my choice. So I decided to put it to the test. If I could give these things up easily, and I did it over Lent for 40 days, if I could easily give this up, then I could prove it. I wasn't addicted, and therefore I'm Catholic, so the Catholic Church was wrong, and I could just continue doing these behaviors at my own discretion afterwards. Right? You can hopefully see a pattern of just my stubbornness of this all, but. Essentially, the first week or two were super easy. Didn't think about it at all. But it was about that third week when it started kind of coming back into my mind. And by the fourth week, it was about all I could think about. I'm about 25 days into this so-called fast, and it had started to take over my life. Just the desire, the urge to watch something, any type of commercial that was a little bit over-sexualized would trigger me. And I just started to realize how much this had been in control of my life, that it was truly an addiction, that it was really becoming immobilizing in my life. And so, once I kind of put a name to it, oh my goodness, I'm addicted. That was the first confession that I went to confess the sin of masturbation. I had, up to that point, never had, because I didn't think it was wrong. And I wish I could say, from that moment of acknowledging that I had an addiction, that I didn't want it anymore in my life, and that I, confessed and gave this to Jesus and the church and said, I don't want this anymore. That, of course, I wish I was just free of it, never to fall into it again. But really, that's where my story began, because, it wasn't a quick fix for me. It took many years to really dig myself out of that hole. And in part, I think it's because there really weren't resources available for women. I didn't really feel like I had anywhere to turn. And, that's the biggest part of my personal story. But the quick part of me now serving in ministry for it is essentially after college, through a whole different, version of my story, I was led into ministry and became a full-time missionary on college campuses. And I started to realize that what had, plagued me my whole life was I was not isolated in my struggle, that many women I was working with had this experience and struggle that they couldn't really break free from. And so what I had been using to help me seek freedom in these areas, I started to help other women that I was working with. And then I, applied it to our missionary training, because of course at the time there wasn't a women's specific training for this. And so I then, because I was really the only one willing to speak out about it, became the expert on pornography masturbation struggles. And so teaching missionaries to help them with their students essentially just snowballed. And so for the past 6 years now, I've made this a huge, if not main part of my ministry, wrote a book about it and done all of that. And it is such a joy. I mean, you'd think that that's, doesn't make sense, an oxymoron, to have such a joyful experience helping women in these struggles. But it's truly a passion of mine now, because of my own experience and because of seeing the freedom of so many women experiencing after having someone to shed this truth. So yeah, that's my story.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So was it not until you were on college campuses as a missionary that you actually realized other women struggled the way that you did?
I think so. I think at least of course I probably would have said, of course some people struggle with this, but I also knew, in my college experience, I knew women who would blatantly say that they struggle with they wouldn't have said struggled. They would have blatantly said, I masturbate, as I'm a woman, I'm empowered. And so I saw kind of either you've owned this and this is something you want to do and this is part of your life and you chose it and you love it, or you don't struggle with it at all, because, right, no woman in the church struggles, it's just completely hidden. So yeah, it wasn't until I was in college ministry where I realized that there are women who don't want this in their life, like I didn't at that point, who are really struggling and had been exposed at such a young age. Most of the women, I just assumed they chose it for themselves when they were 18 years old, right? And then it was when I was working in college ministry that I learned that was not the case. So.
Oh. It's really interesting. I resonate with it's a joy to do this, right? Because I never would have sought out this ministry for myself, but knowing that this is my story, this is what God had done in my life, and I could help other women not walk the same road of isolation and loneliness that I did. It's a joy. It's a joy to see them come clean, to become well, to surrender their lives to the Lord, and to choose a different way, because there's a better way than living the lives that we've both led. So I almost find it comforting in a sense that the Protestant church and the Catholic church both were definitely silent about female pornography struggles, and that there wasn't something I was missing out on in terms of the church talking about this on a greater scale. Are you seeing changes in the church, in the Catholic church now as well?
I definitely think so. I would say, I never felt, it's interesting. So our training, if you will, as a missionary, we had a speaker who would share statistics about the pornography issue, and they would talk about men, and they would share anecdotes of how to receive healing. And of course, every story was about a man, and they would always qualify at the end. And this man would say, "Oh, and women struggle with this too," and then kind of trail off. And so there was that gleaming hope, that at least he mentioned it. And a really big advocate, Audrey Assad, spoke out about this and gave her testimony in kind of a letter written format and read it to me during a Catholic conference a few years before I started doing this. And she was probably the first person at a Catholic conference that I had heard as a woman speaking out about this. And because she was a well-known musician, it kind of allowed women to come to the talk and not feel embarrassed because they were attending the porn talk. And I, turning around and seeing how many women in the Catholic Church were desiring this type of content. And so I think there were like inklings of it, before I really started. But I would say, talking to priests who are in the confessional and hear the confessions of women. I talked to a friend priest of mine who, after I published a book, he was like, "Thank you, Kelsey, for writing about this. Of the female confessions I hear on a college campus, 50% of them include this." 50%. And I wouldn't have been one of those 50% because I was avoiding confession or thinking I didn't need to confess. So to imagine how many women could have this as part of their story is growing for sure. And so I would say the church is, slowly but surely gaining in its resources. And I've only seen more women feel empowered to stand up and speak out about this. Kind of what you're sharing, you hoped you'd have 20 speakers and now you have twice that amount. So I think there's definitely been a surge of recognition and acceptance of it. And I think there still is sometimes an old school thought that it's only men who struggle with this. And I think that's just because with the internet and the accessibility, some people don't fully understand what that is doing to our young people. Mm-hmm. There's a statistic that I shared that I found fascinating, and it showed, Barna Group did this study, and it showed in the past month, 79% of men reported that they had watched pornography in the past month. And that was in the age group of 18 to 30. And that number was only 76% for women. So it was only a 3% difference for women. But when you change the age group to 30 to 45 or even beyond that, for men, it only drops to like 75% of men, and women, it drops down to 16%. So you actually see over the age of 30, the percentage went from 76% to 16%. That's a huge swing. And so at some points, I don't blame some of the leadership in the church, the ministers and people like that, because in their upbringing, it might not have been as big of an issue. I say that because it still could have been. I wasn't there. I'm 30 now. So I think about I'm right at the cusp of when it's actually exploded. And so I have to, with grace and patience, anytime I do get some pushback, well, you're kind of only a niche topic. I'm like, okay, I have to understand you don't realize what we're dealing with and that this is the majority now. So,
yeah. The vast majority of the speakers that we have during the summit, they are millennials. They're, late 20s to maybe late 30s. The vast majority of us, I'm 30, almost 36. I stumbled upon pornography as a magazine. A lot of women who are talking about this weekend or this week also found it by magazines first, and then or cable TV. But we know that the Gen Z generation, they're finding it on their phones, their computers, their tablets, their gaming systems,
apps. Just even like a commercial app, you could think you're completely safe, and It's horrifying. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so when we are seeing that difference and talking about what's it look like in the church, the big C church across the globe, because it's true, our grandmothers probably didn't struggle with pornography. Our moms, maybe erotic novels. Now it's the younger we get, it's all of the above. And it's getting younger and younger and younger. So us women who have been through it and who have found recovery and healing, we have an obligation to share and to say, this is a road you don't want to walk down because it's so entrapping. So talking about your own recovery, what were some of the cornerstone pillar things that like you had to work through in order to find your healing?
Definitely. I think, and I talk about this too, the first step, if you will, and I hate using the word steps because it's kind of a long journey, if you will, but is prayer and inviting Jesus into the struggle, I think was the hardest thing for me to do. And really, I never saw much transformation until I was able to do that. I think if you look at recovering from a pornography or masturbation addiction as gritting your teeth and just like holding your breath and hoping that like you can get through the temptation and you'll be good, like there could be some of that in the initial phase of trying to overcome this. But if that's all you're relying on is self-mastery, this is going to be something that's always a part of your story. At least I have not seen anyone where that's not the case. Even if you look at AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is always to acknowledge that there's a higher power. And that's just the nature of overcoming an addiction, is to understand the supernatural nature, is that we need our creator to help us in something that our bodies have been trained to desire. And so to allow supernatural grace to come into that and help us not have that attachment anymore is vital. But I think, you know, as a Christian, as someone following Jesus and the Lord, you want him to be proud of you and you want him to love you. And you think because you have an addiction to pornography or masturbation that there's no way Jesus could love you, or that there's no way he could look at you and that you're worthy of that love, or that you deserve that love, or anything. And so the biggest moment of being able to walk towards recovery is inviting Jesus into the struggle and telling him that it's something I struggled with, and inviting him into the depths of the wounds that my heart was trying to fill with pornography and masturbation, and asking him to fill those instead. And it was a lot of tears. It was a lot of wrestling with him, frustration that he didn't just take the struggle away. That's another thing that I think can get confusing is, you know, I have encountered women who pray and ask Jesus to take this from them, and he does, you know, just the miracles in scriptures, you know, immediate freedom. And that's such a gift, but that's not always how he works. And I think for me, that's kind of what I wanted. And so even praying through the frustration, if he doesn't remove this immediately, to still trust in him, because for me and my healing and recovery, I realized there was a lot of deeper seated desires for love and desires for comfort and safety that I hadn't gotten previously in my life. And so me seeking out these things was a way of acting out on those. And until I was able to address those root issues, I was never able to be fully healed. And so Jesus wasn't just going to take away my temptation for pornography and masturbation, because I think if he had done that, I would have never gotten to the root issues of what I was desiring, and I would have never received full healing, which is what he wants for us. He doesn't just want women to just not have addictions. I mean, I'm sure that would be great, but he actually wants our entire heart. He wants our entire self, and he wants us to be whole and to be fully healed. And so I'm very thankful that he made me take the long road. But that's the initial road to recovery, was bringing Jesus into it and naming it and inviting him for those day-by-day steps towards full freedom. So
I know a lot of women who are watching this might have some maybe identity issues with God, kind of losing their identity in him, or not seeing God for being the loving father that we're told that he is. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So kind of as I'm sharing like these deeper issues or things that I'm seeking out, I kind of noticed a trend by women I was speaking with and helping with in this struggle. And I started to see the pattern of desiring this type of love, right? You look at pictures of an old couple holding hands on a bench, or you see just the phenomenon love of, I mean, you look at The Notebook, and don't even get me started on how terrible The Notebook is, but you look at this storyline of this love that lasts through the ages, through Alzheimer's, right? There's a desire in our hearts for this kind of unconditional love that comes out. And what happens when you look at pornography and masturbation is it's a distortion of our desire, but our desire is not bad. And so what I mean by that is, if I looked at kind of Genesis and how we were created as beings, and you see in Genesis that when God made man, he made us in his image and likeness. And I don't know if you've ever thought, like, what does that actually mean? Like, being made in God's image and likeness, because that's a kind of a big deal. And so I just started thinking, I was like, who is God? You know, if we're made in his own image and likeness, who is God? And I realized God in and of himself is the Trinity. He is a relationship. So, on a diagram, you could draw this out as, you have God the Father, who gave his entire self and put his entire self into the Son and loved the Son. And Jesus' first role was to receive love from the Father. And it was only in receiving love from the Father that he could turn that back to him and give himself back to the Father. And through this eternal exchange of love between the Father and Son, the Holy Spirit is begotten, right? It's kind of a simplified diagram of the Trinity. Mm-hmm. And God in his infinite wisdom gave us an opportunity to experience this. With Jesus Christ, he came, so he put Jesus in that initial spot. He gave his entire life. He died on the cross for us, put us on that other side. And our first role as man is to receive love from God, receive Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection. All of that is pouring out. And then only then can we turn that love back to God. And through that eternal exchange of love, we experience divine life. And so that's kind of our earthly way of participating in Trinitarian love. And that's what we're made for. That is our identity. We're made in the image and likeness of God. We're made for relationship. And I think we don't talk about that enough, because when you look at our sexual desires, they come from a desire for connection and intimacy and relationship, right? This desire to be in communion, to be one with someone else. And that is spiritual. I mean, it is actually a gift, and it is how we are made, and that is good. And so when you look at, the marital union of sex, and you look at the husband whose first role is to pour his entire self out to his spouse, the wife, as a woman, biologically, our bodies are made to receive our spouse first. Like, that is the first act, is to receive our spouse. And only then can we turn and give everything back to him, body, mind, heart, soul, all of it. And it's through this exchange that hopefully new life can come forth with a new baby, maybe. And I think that is another earthly way through the covenant of marriage that you can participate in Trinitarian love. If you are Catholic and can be a religious sister, you actually get to participate in that first example of divine life with Jesus in a vow on earth, which is remarkable. But I would say when you add pornography and masturbation into that, you look at that husband and wife diagram, you sever those relationships. You have the man who, if he's watching pornography, he just turns that love back in on himself. As a woman, you just turn that love. You don't need a man to give you pleasure or to give you himself. You can actually fulfill yourself all by yourself. And this is where our culture is telling us as women that you don't need a man. You are entirely empowered by yourself. And it is damaging, because our identity as sons and daughters of God, as daughters, is to be fully loved unconditionally, to receive this ultimate love. That pornography and masturbation are false versions of it. They are just lesser versions. And no matter how much you consume, you will always be dissatisfied. You will always be unfulfilled. And I think that's where you just see so many people, who have sex addictions, who have pornography and masturbation addictions, who need to go to strip clubs, and they try and start seeking this false version of love, because it makes a promise like, hey, you don't need to work at it. You don't need to give your entire self. You can just experience this on the side and get the pleasure and the fun without giving your entire self. And we know that it won't satisfy you. And so I think when I hear identity, I saw it so many times with women, is it played out in different ways, whether they were seeking bad relationships, men who were emotionally or physically abusive. It could be a relationship with a parent that was never fully, strengthened, and there wasn't a full sense of security and love in that relationship. So they seek out pornography and masturbation to feel that love in those other ways. Whatever it is, it's our ultimate desire to be connected to the Father, who's the only one who can give us this unconditional love that we're trying to fulfill in these other ways that the world promises and can never fulfill. So I would say, yes, pornography and masturbation are symptoms. They're not the root cause of what's going on here. They're symptoms of our desire to be in full communion with our Creator. And so starting there, inviting Jesus in, I said how that was such a turning point in my own recovery. Starting at that turning point of, Jesus is the one that you're seeking in these struggles, surrendering these struggles to Him to begin that is really where all of this is coming from. So
that is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful for me too, just going forward in life. Whenever there's something difficult that comes, always just turning towards the Father who loves me, and trusting that He's going to get me through, and I don't have to look for outward things to satisfy an inward hurt, right? So thank you for that. Your book is called Uncompromising Purity, which is a great title, by the way. Obviously, you talk about purity a lot, but a lot of women who are watching this feel so far from pure that they feel like purity is lost for them. Like, it's not able to come back. Can you speak to that woman right now who has that feeling?
Yes. Yeah, we debated on the title of the book, and originally it was going to just be uncompromising. But we didn't know if that would be too vague, and there was a whole bunch of debate, because I do think there is a misconception around the term purity, whether it's, I'm not pure, or even just like, I feel like purity and prude can kind of sometimes, and that, prude has gotten a negative connotation. But purity, from everything I've understood, and if you look at scripture and you look at purity, it does not mean, you could look at maybe a blanket definition. You could say, it means sinless or stainless. And sure, but if we actually look at what Jesus has promised in terms of His power and ability of forgiveness, us coming to Him with a sin or a stain and saying, Jesus, forgive me. And if you are Catholic, going to a priest, persona Christi, so in the person of Christ, and saying, Jesus, do you forgive me? Please forgive me. If we truly believe that Jesus Christ came, God came into human form, died on the cross and rose from the dead, to believe that He has the power to forgive our sins and make us sinless, we have to trust in that, and we have to believe that. And so purity is not just I'm pure because I've done nothing wrong ever in my life, because we know none of us can say that, regardless if pornography, masturbation are a struggle with you. I use the analogy in my book. I talk about gossiping. I'm like, if I work with a young group of women, I'm like, who here thinks gossiping is a good thing? And of course, no one raises their hand. And then I say, who here has gossiped? And of course, all slowly the hands go up. And then I just started asking, okay, like, why do you gossip? If we know it's not good, why do we do it? And they start listing off how they justify it and whatnot. And, it's good to get things off your chest, and it creates more community, and you can pray for the women that you're talking about that might have this issue. And yeah, you can justify things for a million reasons, but gossiping is just as much a sin and a stain as something like a sexual addiction. And so if you think just because you have a sexual addiction that you're not pure, I think that's a lie. And that's a lie from the evil one that's trying to keep you from full freedom. And so when I talk about purity, I'm talking about the woman who has struggled, and to be honest, has been a victim, because the reality of it is most of us were exposed at a very early age, not at an age of reason, and at a time where we were choosing our exposure. And even if you chose your exposure, we were a victim to this industry that has created content that they know is addictive, and that can trigger certain things in our biological body to make us keep needing more. When we were innocently not aware that that's what it was doing to us. It might have been curiosity or whatnot. So whatever situation your exposure was, we were the victims. And so for women to be a victim in this industry and this culture of sexual progress that people are claiming, to think that we can't go to Jesus and say, Jesus, I didn't want this, is a lie, like I've said before. But the purity that comes from Jesus Christ, I messed up, do you forgive me? That type of purity of being redeemed, the redemption that comes from that is actually, I would say, a brighter white than the person who has been shut in a closet and hasn't experienced any temptation. I mean, you look at Jesus Christ, and even he experienced temptation, right, in the desert, and went through a lot of our human experiences to show us that is part of the journey and that it can be redeemed. And so I think to that woman, that's something I would share, is that Jesus did not want this to happen to you. And when you think about that first exposure, when you're praying Jesus, inviting him into this, to pray about your first exposure and ask Jesus, where were you, right? Like the first time you were exposed to this, Jesus, where were you when that happened to me, when that was exposed to me? And I guarantee you, he was not in the back corner pointing a finger going, shame on you. I don't love you anymore. No, he was right next to you, screaming and bawling his eyes out and yelling on the top of his lungs that his daughter just had been violated like this, that she had been exposed and been a victim to this. And he hated that it happened. And I think when you start to see these issues like that, the question of I'm not pure shouldn't even come into play, because if you were made in the image and likeness of God, if you were made as Jesus's daughter, and all you have to do is welcome him back into your life, you are pure. And if you're walking with him every day and you're accepting his love, you are pure. And that's kind of what this uncompromising purity is about, is to not compromise in what the world is telling you is going to make you happy, what the world is going to tell you will fulfill you, to be uncompromising so that you can have that purity, because that's what we're made for, and that's what Jesus wants for you. So that's what I would say.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was really, really helpful. Thank you very much. For those who are interested in learning more about your ministry and your book, how can they find out more?
So I just, on kelseyskoch.com/purity, I have a whole bunch of resources, and the first one there is a link to purchase my book, which, if you buy a single copy, it's $8. In bulk, it's as low as $3. So I just wanted it to be very available for any woman who might have this. International, it can, be sent all over the world. So, Kelsey Skoch, so KelseySkoch.com/purity is where they can find it.
Thank you very much. We will be linking to Kelsey's site from the Summit site on her speaker page. So be sure to check out her site, check out her resources. And Kelsey, thank you so much for being part of our summit.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. Thanks for having me.